You referred to the tragic taking of 1,200 lives as an act of resistance, so state it again right now to this entire chamber. Byron Donalds remained on his feet despite the seated format and fixed microphones dictated by committee rules, yet no one instructed him to take his seat. Rashida Tlaib gazed at him from the opposite side of the room as her mouth opened and shut without repeating her previous statement. The House Oversight Committee rarely attracts a large audience because it normally serves as routine broadcast filler featuring politicians in gray suits reading scripted remarks to mostly vacant chairs. However, on the morning of March 11th, the corridor outside room 2154 inside the Rayburn building was crowded all the way to the elevators, and Capitol Security had already denied entry to 200 individuals before the session even began. The explanation was straightforward since Byron Donalds had called for the session specifically focusing on Rashida Tlaib, and everyone throughout Washington understood the implications of that request. Donalds possessed a specific reputation that did not rely on volume or stem from shouting on television broadcasts or publishing provocative social media posts in the early hours of the morning. His standing was much more subtle and consequently more formidable within the Capitol, making him the type of figure who sat opposite network anchors and caused them to lament the conversation. A video clip showing him asking a television panel whether they planned to force their opinions on him or allow him an opportunity to talk had accumulated well over 1 million views. Another recording of him accusing a news host of psychological manipulation became an overnight sensation, and when a popular radio show attempted to trap him regarding inflation, he carefully explained the economics until the presenters shifted the topic. He never achieved victory in debates by projecting the most volume, but rather by arriving exceptionally well-equipped, and the document folder resting on his desk that day indicated extreme readiness. Donald showed up 12 minutes ahead of schedule without a large group, accompanied by a single aide carrying one folder, before sitting down to review his notes without looking around or greeting the attendees. For those unfamiliar with his background, the essential details included being raised by a single mother in Crown Heights, which was the sort of Brooklyn neighborhood where surviving adolescence meant you could endure absolutely any challenge. He successfully navigated those early challenges to earn a finance degree from Florida State before entering the banking and insurance sectors, where professionals learn to analyze spreadsheets with the same intuitive precision a mechanic uses to diagnose a failing engine. His path led through the state legislature into federal office, ultimately resulting in a televised nomination for House Speaker as a black conservative from public housing whom half the Capitol never anticipated, and the remainder still struggled to comprehend. Tlaib walked in 1 minute past the hour, accompanied by 3 assistants, a communications chief, and an attorney, which marked an unprecedented decision since she had never previously brought legal counsel to a congressional inquiry. She took her seat and organized her documents while staring directly forward, wearing the unmistakable expression of someone who had predetermined that no words spoken in that chamber would carry any significance. Lifting his gaze from the organized files for the initial time, Donalds deliberately bypassed looking directly at his colleague and instead locked his eyes onto the broadcasting lens. He stated his intention to address the American citizens tuning in from home rather than his fellow committee members, emphasizing that the upcoming presentation contained vital information the public deserved to witness despite extensive internal efforts to conceal it. Turning toward the representative, he recounted the tragic events of early October where 1,200 innocent individuals spanning all generations were brutally killed at a public gathering, representing the most devastating violence against the Jewish community since the mid-20th century, before asking her to confirm with a simple affirmative or negative if a terror group committed those acts. The representative leaned closer to her microphone with a prepared response ready to deliver, just as she consistently maintained a rehearsed reply for difficult inquiries. She began explaining that the regional situation was profoundly intricate and required acknowledging many decades of historical context, which prompted the room to murmur because her statement clearly evaded a direct affirmation. He immediately interrupted to remind his colleague that his inquiry required only a binary response regarding the events of a single specific day rather than a historical summary spanning 3/4 of a century. While her attorney murmured a suggestion she completely ignored, She claimed to have continually denounced all violence against innocent populations, leading Donalds to lean back in silence before telling the viewers to note her 3 failures to provide an unqualified affirmative response as they were only beginning the proceeding. Nearly a month following the most lethal assault on Jewish noncombatants in modern history, she published a digital recording that offered neither sympathy nor denunciation, but instead accused the American commander-in-chief of endorsing the systemic eradication of the Palestinian population. Donalds possessed a printed chronological record which he reviewed without any haste, studying the document with the careful scrutiny of a person analyzing a financial receipt containing obvious discrepancies. He detailed the initial assault where hundreds were brutally victimized, many were abducted into captivity, and a peaceful musical gathering was violently transformed into an area of horrific devastation and unspeakable tragedy. He firmly asserted that these specific historical occurrences are not subject to factual debate or complex interpretation because they undeniably took place. On the following morning, while desperate relatives were still hunting for missing loved ones and frantic parents were leaving voice messages for their missing children, you uploaded a broadcast demanding an end to systemic segregation that supposedly breeds the terrible conditions causing such resistance. Lifting his eyes from the paper, he pointedly emphasized her choice of the word resistance to describe an event that resulted in over 1,000 tragic fatalities. You labeled that extreme violence as a form of resistance rather than identifying it as terrorism or a horrific atrocity, causing a female spectator in the public seating area to physically cover her mouth in shock. 10 days subsequently, when a medical facility in the conflict zone was struck, you utilized social media within hours to falsely declare that the allied nation had bombed the hospital and caused massive casualties, tagging both the president and your peers to ensure millions viewed the claim. The singular issue was the complete lack of truth in that statement, as American intelligence definitively confirmed for the public that the explosion resulted from a misdirected projectile launched by a local militant faction rather than a foreign military strike. Domestic intelligence networks, international military allies, and numerous independent analysts all verified this reality by demonstrating that the impact crater and flight path pointed exclusively to a faulty local launch rather than an aerial bombardment. However, before the factual corrections could circulate, your digital message had already reached millions of readers, fueled various public demonstrations, provided a pretext for hostile actions against Jewish university students, and proliferated globally across numerous online networks in multiple languages. A complete falsehood that you personally authored managed to circle the globe before the actual facts could even begin to emerge, prompting him to pause and ask whether she had ever removed that specific digital post. The representative maintained her silence as he confirmed she had neither deleted the message, issued any formal correction, nor offered an apology to the allied nation for the false bombing accusation, which caused her jaw to visibly tense. She attempted to pivot by mentioning civilian suffering, but he immediately interjected to demand a binary answer regarding an apology, pointing out that she continued to stand by her advocacy while leaving the inaccurate post publicly accessible for anyone with a mobile device to read. An elected federal representative incorrectly blamed a sovereign allied country for striking a medical center, and even though her own government corrected the record, that digital deception remains active and continues to be circulated widely. An individual seated in the journalism area let out a highly noticeable breath, producing the distinct noise associated with confronting an uncomfortable truth that was long suspected but preferably avoided. On the 3rd of November, you uploaded a personally branded video montage that concluded with large crowds vocally demanding freedom from the river to the sea. To eliminate any potential confusion regarding that specific phrase, especially since you later characterized it as an optimistic plea for human rights and harmonious living, I must clarify its actual historical definition. That particular chant serves as a foundational motto for the militant organization, explicitly written into their charter to mandate the total erasure of the neighboring nation across that entire geographic expanse. Whenever that faction or its devoted followers vocalize those words during public demonstrations, they are expressing a literal demand for a nation's complete dissolution rather than reciting a peaceful or aspirational political metaphor. You actively chose to include that exact rhetoric in your public messaging just 3 weeks after a terror organization weaponized that identical ideology to carry out a massive and deadly assault. By November 8th, your own Democratic peers joined the opposition in a 234 to 188 vote to formally discipline you, with 22 members of your specific political faction voting against your interests. A Jewish Democratic colleague named Brad Schneider explicitly went on record stating that the slogan represented absolutely nothing less than a direct demand for national annihilation and targeted violence against his people. That severe criticism did not originate from a conservative media outlet, but rather from a fellow legislator seated just a few rows away, Donalds noted as he lowered his printed timeline. Throughout the entire 234-year existence of the federal legislature, merely 26 elected officials have ever faced formal censure, and you hold the distinctive honor of being the 26th. That unprecedented formal reprimand represents your actual political legacy rather than an example of discriminatory targeting, prompting the representative to suddenly lean forward and rapidly unleash the heated defense she had suppressed all morning. She accused him of perpetuating a systemic tradition of suppressing minority women and Muslim perspectives, aggressively claiming he was attempting to mute anyone courageous enough to dispute the established narrative regarding her community. She passionately reminded the room of her unique heritage and her grandmother's overseas residency, refusing to accept lectures from him before Donalds immediately lowered the pitch of his voice to interrupt her. His urban roots became entirely evident through a tone that was remarkably heavy rather than excessively loud, resembling the definitive sound of a heavy door shutting permanently. He firmly introduced himself as a black man raised by a single mother in Crown Heights who had endured every imaginable political insult from both sides of the aisle across various media platforms. He recounted how Cori Bush labeled him a tool for racial supremacy, while Jasmine Crockett scrutinized his interracial marriage, noting that critics from all political factions constantly questioned his racial authenticity and patriotism. He demanded she cease complaining about being suppressed, arguing that true marginalization looks absolutely nothing like an elected official possessing a federal mandate, a professional staff, and unlimited access to broadcast microphones. He clarified that demanding accountability through direct questioning is fundamentally different from oppressive silencing, suggesting that her inability to distinguish between the two concepts constituted the core issue. Absolute silence blanketed the hearing room until an individual positioned within the journalism sector quietly uttered a mild profanity that was barely picked up by the surrounding audio equipment. The representative stared blankly across the table as her thoroughly rehearsed defensive strategy relying on marginalization and unique ethnic identity violently collided with an insurmountable rhetorical obstacle. This failure occurred primarily because the colleague sitting opposite her possessed an equally extensive background of facing systemic discrimination, yet he actively refused to utilize his demographic profile as a defensive barrier. She cast a desperate glance toward her legal counsel, who merely studied his notepad, while Donalds allowed his aggressive urban inflection to mellow into a much more subdued cadence. His tone transformed into that of a seasoned financial professional who recalled his days analyzing corporate credit risks and studying complex balance sheets in a quiet Florida office long before entering the political arena. Having developed a keen sense for detecting financial irregularities and excessively routed funds, he boldly proposed shifting the conversation toward fiscal matters because currency trails are inherently incapable of deception. While regular citizens and elected officials frequently traffic in falsehoods, financial ledgers perpetually reveal the unvarnished truth to those trained to comprehend them, and he had dedicated his entire career to that specific analytical skill. Over a 5-year period ending in 2025, your political organization transferred roughly $600,000 to a specialized consulting agency managed by an individual named Rasha Mubarak. Allowing the specific name to resonate with the domestic viewing audience who likely lacked the relevant context, he volunteered to clearly articulate exactly why identifying this particular individual carried such immense significance. This consultant maintains established professional connections with a prominent Islamic Relations Council that aggressively markets itself to the general public strictly as a mainstream civil rights advocacy organization. However, federal justice officials previously designated this exact advocacy group as an unindicted participant during the highly publicized legal proceedings concerning the massive Holy Land Foundation financial network. That specific judicial process represented the most extensive terror funding prosecution in domestic history and culminated in multiple executives facing convictions for secretly routing $12 million directly to an extremist faction. Those millions of dollars were illegally transferred, and the related advocacy group was officially implicated in the conspiracy by nonpartisan federal litigators rather than conservative politicians or right-leaning media networks. Furthermore, the consultant is professionally associated with a global justice alliance that federal investigators scrutinized regarding its operational ties to a radical collective operating under the umbrella of a known extremist liberation front. That overarching liberation front operates strictly as an officially designated terror syndicate, and the connected collective recently faced a total operational ban in Germany due to its violent advocacy. Hundreds of thousands of dollars sourced from working-class constituents in Michigan were ultimately funneled into a business managed by someone deeply enmeshed with both historic illicit funding networks and internationally sanctioned extremist groups. Raising a palm to halt her inevitable interruption, he explicitly clarified that he was not directly accusing her of funding violent syndicates, emphasizing that he consistently selects his vocabulary with extreme precision. He simply observed that her campaign directed a massive fortune of contributor funds toward a professional whose immediate network features organizations historically tethered to federally outlawed militant factions. Operating under his designated oversight authority, he demanded to know if she possessed prior knowledge of these links, arguing that remaining ignorant constituted a massive failure of her basic administrative duties. The representative provided a monotonous and heavily practiced retort that was perfectly engineered for brief television segments lacking any rigorous journalistic follow-up questions. She dismissed the inquiry as a prejudice smear campaign, insisting the connected entities were entirely legitimate enterprises, while forcefully rejecting the underlying implication that collaborating with Islamic advocacy groups constituted inherent criminality. While that polished deflection might have satisfied a sympathetic cable news host who would simply transition to a new topic, this was a congressional hearing and her opponent refused to yield. He swiftly countered that he had specifically referenced entities tied to recognized terror networks by federal agents, pointing out that equating radical syndicates with mainstream religious organizations was completely intellectually dishonest. He argued that her deliberate attempt to convince the public that investigating illicit militant financing equates to religious bigotry demonstrated the exact structural problem with her ongoing political methodology. By intentionally blurring the boundaries between faithful citizens and radical elements, she actively endangers innocent religious minorities by creating an environment where basic security inquiries inevitably trigger unwarranted accusations of extreme prejudice. The Congresswoman opened her mouth to protest but ultimately remained silent, finally choosing to heed the whispered advice her legal counsel urgently offered during the brief pause. Transitioning to a new topic, he noted that the Parliamentary Ethics Board previously mandated she refund over $10,000 to her own political organization following improper personal expenditures. He emphasized that this was a factual ruling by a nonpartisan oversight body proving she illegally utilized working-class contributions to fund her personal lifestyle before being forced to provide restitution. Although the sum appears relatively insignificant when contrasted with the larger consulting fees, the incident remains deeply relevant because it successfully establishes a clear and troubling behavioral pattern. This specific behavioral trend demonstrates a willingness to direct external funds based entirely on personal desires, while operating under the assumption that financial regulations exclusively apply to everyone else. Continuing with the theme of established trends, he introduced another piece of evidence regarding a bipartisan legislative effort intended to ban foreign militants involved in the recent catastrophic assault from crossing domestic borders. The incredibly straightforward proposal, designed simply to exclude dangerous extremists, received overwhelming support with 422 affirmative votes, yet you stood as one of only 2 dissenting legislators. He paused to emphasize the staggering margin, pointing out that her own political faction and even her most radically progressive ideological allies cast affirmative votes while she alone refused to support the security measure. Even if her subsequent claim regarding the legislation's redundancy held legal merit, standing virtually alone against a unified legislature seeking to block known militant operatives functioned as a profound ideological declaration rather than a mere procedural technicality. As he noted that the public received that message clearly, she remained entirely mute while her media director frantically typed on a smartphone and her attorney slid unread legal advice across the table. Referencing a specific political convention hosted in Detroit during the spring of 2024, Donalds extracted a solitary image from his files and displayed it prominently for the broadcasting equipment. He indicated that the picture featured the representative sharing a stage at that exact gathering alongside a highly controversial individual who was clearly visible within the same unedited photographic frame. This specific companion was a legally convicted operative functioning within a banned terror syndicate, having historically managed underground propaganda distribution for the extremist group during the late 20th century. Following the horrific violence of early October, this individual entirely abstained from expressing nuanced emotions or condemnations, opting instead to publicly and aggressively defend the massive militant strike. He championed the brutal slaughter of hundreds of innocent victims right before you chose to share a public platform with him, prompting the Congresswoman to defensively assert that she cannot possibly background check every person present at her numerous scheduled appearances. He expressed extreme disbelief that her team would fail to screen a convicted militant sharing her immediate proximity at a hometown convention, swiftly shutting down her claim of mischaracterization by pointing out the undeniable photographic evidence. A strange murmur hovering between muted amusement and genuine astonishment washed across the viewing gallery, as the audience collectively recognized the complete impossibility of formulating an adequate defense against such visual proof. Beyond the presence of problematic operatives, the event hosted numerous orators demanding the Allied nations' complete destruction, characterizing the recent atrocities as valiant liberation efforts, and aggressively peddling the identical river-to-sea rhetoric she previously deemed peacefully aspirational. He bluntly informed his colleague that the gathering functioned as a celebratory militant rally rather than a diplomatic summit, noting with disgust that she served as the primary attraction. Reading directly from a recently published security dossier, he quoted analysts asserting that the representative consistently utilizes her massive platform to endorse and amplify groups maintaining deep ideological or functional links to illicit terror networks. He clarified that these severe allegations stemmed entirely from meticulously documented public records, financial campaign disclosures, and verifiable attendance logs rather than partisan media speculation or personal animosity. Furthermore, the document explicitly stated that her political war chest benefited greatly from contributors aligned with radical brotherhood networks, while her legislative priorities seamlessly mirrored their specific strategic goals. Acknowledging the extreme gravity of the situation, he argued that the combination of suspicious donations, highly controversial rhetoric, and an isolated voting record inevitably transforms from mere coincidence into deliberate operational policy. Extracting an additional file from his collection, he referenced a second formal reprimand introduced during the fall of 2025 that condemned her continued participation in events orchestrated by extremist affiliates. He highlighted her completely unique and troubling historical status as the singular active federal legislator to ever encounter multiple formal censures specifically concerning breaches of national security. Placing the visual evidence on the desk beneath the written reports, he folded his hands together and admitted that one specific recurring thought deeply and genuinely disturbed his conscience. During the initial disciplinary debates, she had displayed a portrait of her elderly relative residing in a disputed overseas territory, weaponizing the emotional image to argue for the absolute necessity of her continued legislative presence. He confessed that her impassioned presentation was nearly successful because the image of an elderly civilian merely seeking a tranquil existence carried an undeniable and potent authenticity. However, the critical flaw in her emotional appeal remained the fact that her innocent relative was not the person who falsely broadcasted severe military accusations across social media channels. Her aging matriarch neither labeled horrific mass casualties as a justifiable struggle nor willingly shared a public speaking platform alongside a legally recognized violent extremist. That elderly woman never authorized massive financial transfers to consulting agencies entangled with outlawed syndicates. The Congresswoman executed those actions entirely on her own initiative. Consequently, whenever she exploits that family portrait to evade professional accountability, she uses her relative just as cynically as she weaponizes her ethnic identity and religious grievances to deflect legitimate criticism. Pivoting aggressively toward the presiding official, her previously rehearsed composure shattered, revealing a tone infused with genuine, unbridled fury for the first time during the proceeding. She loudly demanded the official transcript reflect her assertion that the oversight session had severely degenerated into a prejudiced political assault targeting the chamber's sole representative of her specific demographic. Refusing to match her escalating volume, Donalds noted that she reflexively cited her unique heritage whenever cornered by an unanswerable inquiry, having already deployed the specific phrase 5 separate times that morning. He bluntly informed her that this tactic functioned purely as a transparent defensive mechanism that the entire panel easily recognized, while the presiding chairman simply observed the exchange without attempting to intervene. When her legal counsel attempted to intervene by grabbing the microphone, she forcefully swatted his hand aside and opted for complete silence while multiple broadcast lenses captured the entire humiliating sequence. Although initially slated for only 2 hours, the session stretched deep into its third hour because the chairman abandoned procedural time limits once aides alerted him to the massively surging digital viewership metrics. Pushing his finalized document folder away toward the desk's perimeter, Donalds looked forward with entirely empty hands and announced his intention to conclude the session without relying on prepared notes. The atmosphere within the chamber fundamentally transformed in a manner resembling a musical composition, shifting into a new, compelling key that forces listeners to lean closer in anticipation. He solemnly reminded her that upon entering federal office, she exercised her constitutional right to swear her allegiance upon her chosen religious text, mirroring his own solemn vow to protect the nation's foundational documents. Despite pledging to shield the Republic against every conceivable threat, she spent the evening of her swearing-in ceremony gleefully promising her supporters on camera that she intended to immediately pursue the president's impeachment using highly profane language. After allowing the profound disrespect of that moment to resonate, he clarified that while he was unbothered by crude vocabulary due to his rough upbringing, he wanted citizens to recognize the vast philosophical void separating her sworn promises from her actual character. Following her pledge of honor, she maliciously and incorrectly accused an ally of attacking a medical center without ever issuing a retraction, before subsequently categorizing the horrific slaughter of innocent civilians as a legitimate protest tactic. She violated her sacred vow by echoing the genocidal rhetoric of extremist factions within the federal Capitol buildings and further disgraced her office by willingly associating with convicted operatives who publicly praised massive terror operations. She betrayed her sworn duties by routing vast sums of political contributions into networks scrutinized for funding global violence, subsequently standing nearly alone among hundreds of peers to oppose border restrictions against known militants. Despite her solemn promises, she petulantly withheld her political endorsement from a historic minority candidate within her own party, simply because the nominee refused to adopt her extreme foreign policy demands. While rallying supporters in a crucial battleground territory, she spitefully refused to even speak the candidate's name, having previously demonstrated her lack of integrity by illegally redirecting donor funds toward her private lifestyle until forced to provide restitution. Consequently, dozens of her ideological allies supported severe disciplinary measures against her, not due to racial or religious animosity, but because her actions thoroughly desecrated the fundamental trust required of public servants. Lowering his volume to a near whisper that remained perfectly audible in the stunned silence of the chamber, he reminded his colleague that he had pledged himself to the exact same constitutional framework using the identical terminology. He recounted how, on his initial day in federal service, he immediately telephoned his hardworking mother, a woman who had spent years scrubbing residential properties to ensure her child could afford a university education. Answering the call through tears of profound joy, she congratulated him on achieving such an incredible milestone and sternly warned him never to let anyone strip away the honor he had earned. Unlike her, he avoided profanity and immediate partisan warfare, choosing instead to celebrate the miraculous reality that an impoverished youth from public housing could reach the federal legislature to authentically serve his constituents rather than a radical global movement. He summarized their fundamental divide by noting that while both successfully overcame systemic marginalization to swear an identical pledge, he utilized his oath as a moral compass, whereas she merely wore hers as a deceptive disguise. Repurposing her favorite extremist slogan, he beautifully defined his personal journey from the gritty streets of Brooklyn to the prestigious halls of Washington as his ultimate vision of freedom, noting proudly that his liberation required absolutely zero bloodshed. Rising to his feet once more without facing any procedural reprimand, he reminded her that the very nation she constantly slanders as a genocidal regime actually provided her family with citizenship, vast public influence, and unprecedented legislative power. Instead of expressing gratitude, she actively exploited these extraordinary privileges to broadcast severe falsehoods regarding international partners, elevate individuals who celebrate extreme violence, mainstream genocidal rhetoric, and willfully ignore suspicious financial pipelines connected to dangerous syndicates. Rejecting a notorious historical deflection, he directly accused her of repeatedly shattering her constitutional promises on national television and subsequently weaponizing religious grievances to deflect absolutely all resulting scrutiny. He passionately argued that bigotry represents a severe reality for innocent religious minorities facing genuine oppression, which is vastly different from an elected official encountering standard administrative accountability. By constantly deploying allegations of prejudice to escape questions regarding financial corruption or radical affiliations, she severely devalues the concept and ensures future victims of genuine discrimination will struggle to find necessary support. A suffocating stillness fell over the room before the Congresswoman offered an incredibly feeble response, weakly protesting that her opponent fundamentally misunderstood the specific struggles of her unique demographic. He immediately rejected her premise by asserting his own deep community ties, explaining that his neighborhood instilled a profound responsibility to confront difficult inquiries honestly, rather than using geographic or ethnic origins as a coward's refuge. Turning toward the broadcast lens for the final time, he shared a vital lesson his mother imparted during his adolescence, warning him never to let society force a choice between maintaining his racial identity and doing what was morally correct. He proudly declared that he had successfully maintained both his integrity and his heritage throughout his entire existence, acknowledging the steep personal cost while finding immense comfort in his unbroken constitutional fidelity at the end of every day. Tapping his chest directly above his heart to emphasize his daily commitment, he silently retrieved his document folder and offered a brief nod of respect to the presiding official before exiting the room entirely. An isolated burst of applause erupted from the public seating area and quickly multiplied until half the chamber joined in, prompting the chairman to make only a single half-hearted attempt to restore order before accepting that the organic reaction was completely unstoppable. The representative remained frozen in her seat while her legal counsel rapidly secured his belongings and her media chief scrambled into the corridor to frantically attempt damage control on a narrative that had already spiraled hopelessly out of control. Broadcast technicians deliberately maintained their visual feeds for 11 agonizing seconds, projecting the devastating image of an isolated politician sitting silently before a dormant microphone in what felt like the most protracted moment in the network's extensive history. Digital recordings of the confrontation accumulated 20 million impressions prior to the evening meal, though the most popular segment was not the dramatic conclusion or the memorable costume analogy that quickly spawned massive commercial merchandising. The specific exchange that dominated digital culture and permeated endless conservative communication networks across the nation featured the initial, seemingly simple binary question regarding extremist violence juxtaposed against her disastrously evasive assertion regarding regional complexity. Online communities rapidly branded the embarrassing deflection, continuously editing the audio into humorous formats, while a teenager residing in Tennessee generated 14 million views by pairing the painful silence with a notoriously comedic television theme song The subsequent most popular digital fragment involved the brutal dismantling of her emotional familial defense, highlighting the severe reprimand that her elderly relative was not responsible for posting the false hospital bombing accusations. A creative editor paired that audio with a methodical magnification of the representative's distressed expression, perfectly capturing the agonizing instant she comprehended her primary defensive strategy had been completely obliterated, creating a massively popular digital animation. Prominent conservative television networks repeatedly aired the lengthy conclusion without any interruptions, while influential political commentators rapidly praised the intense confrontation as the single most critical legislative exchange of the entire calendar year. Another highly viewed conservative broadcast extensively featured the lopsided voting record across multiple consecutive evenings, forcefully reminding audiences that the representative stood virtually alone in actively opposing essential national security border restrictions against known militants. In a desperate afternoon press release, her political team characterized the entire devastating proceeding as nothing more than a prejudiced theatrical performance engineered specifically to marginalize her ethnic community and outlaw fundamental humanitarian advocacy. They insisted the representative maintained her unwavering dedication to her specific constituency in Michigan alongside her commitment to marginalized populations globally, but the digital response overwhelmingly mocked the transparently defensive publication. The most prominent public response featured a recording of the infamous resistance comment accompanied by a dismissive caption, while his powerful demand that she stop complaining about systemic silencing dominated online trending topics for several consecutive days. An artist operating in Miami quickly immortalized the phrase beneath a massive painted silhouette of the Florida representative, which the politician subsequently shared across his own digital platforms without adding any supplementary commentary. A former military service member residing in Ohio permanently inked the powerful quote onto his body in a photograph that garnered massive online attention, while multiple liberal colleagues who previously shielded her abruptly refused to offer any supportive statements. An anonymous partisan ally explicitly admitted to political journalists that the entire Liberal coalition desperately wished she had simply provided an affirmative response during the opening exchange, expressing profound frustration over her stubborn refusal. When Byron Donalds finally touched down in Fort Myers later that evening, he walked into his home to find his wife diligently assisting their youngest child with academic assignments in the kitchen. The television remained dark, and the residents maintained a specific serene stillness that naturally occurs whenever youth are deeply focused and the chaotic external world temporarily ceases its relentless intrusions. Following her inquiry about his day, he placed his luggage on the surface and shed his coat before casually mentioning her unprecedented legal counsel and her stunning inability to provide a simple affirmative answer. He explained his repeated failed attempts to force her to classify the horrific violence as a terror operation, prompting his wife to pause briefly before suggesting he immediately contact his mother, which he did with a warm smile. His mother answered the device instantly, enthusiastically confirming she had watched the entire confrontation repeatedly, even hosting a neighbor who provided baked goods during the secondary viewing session. He released his initial genuine laugh of the lengthy day as she praised him for adhering to her teachings regarding unwavering honesty, prompting him to remind her of his colleague's horrific description of the violence. She warmly affirmed her deep appreciation for his fierce intellectual counterattack, explaining that his righteous stand inspired the celebratory neighborhood gathering, while he relaxed against the cabinetry listening to his child study historic American legislative frameworks nearby. The educational reading drifted down the corridor, blending seamlessly with the ambient mechanical hums of household appliances and exterior irrigation systems as the warm southern night peacefully descended around their property. After he fondly recalled her crucial teenage advice regarding maintaining his integrity alongside his racial identity and confessed to sharing it publicly on the broadcast, she paused briefly before proudly declaring that the wisdom was always destined for a broader audience. Meanwhile, inside a public gathering space located in Dearborn, Michigan, where the representative previously hosted highly attended biweekly meetings, a solitary helper was quietly organizing furniture following an unusually abbreviated assembly. Community participation had plummeted drastically to levels no staff member wished to acknowledge, leaving the nearly empty room entirely dominated by a controversial blue and white extremist slogan banner that had hung prominently on the wall for several months. The remaining volunteers stared thoughtfully at the divisive display for an extended period before finally detaching it from the surface, folding the fabric neatly, and permanently hiding it away within a dark supply closet entirely on her own initiative.